On Thanksgiving, in the middle of my own dining room, surrounded by the scent of roasted turkey and pumpkin pie, my son publicly humiliated me. He laughed, cold and sharp, right in front of everyone, making me feel like I was invisible, irrelevant. The room was still, but inside me a storm raged. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share, and if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. I'm Evelyn Margaret Thompson, 73 years old, and I've called Chicago home for over 5 decades. My apartment sits on the 3rd floor of a weathered brick building in Lincoln Park, where the lake winds cut through you like broken promises, and the city hums with a loneliness that echoes in elderly hearts like mine. Every morning, I wake to the same ritual. My arthritic fingers wrap around the same chipped coffee mug, the one with faded roses that my late husband Harold bought me at a farmer's market in Wisconsin 30 years ago. The fluorescent light above my kitchen table flickers with the persistence of hope I used to have. I shuffle to the window in my worn slippers, the ones my granddaughter Lisa gave me for Christmas 3 years ago, before everything changed. From that window, I watch the bare branches sway against the gray November sky. The trees look stripped, vulnerable, much like I felt that Thanksgiving morning, as I prepared what I thought would be our family feast. I had woken before dawn, as I always do, and spent hours in that tiny kitchen. My hands, spotted with age and memories, kneaded the dinner rolls Harold used to love. I prepared my famous cranberry sauce, the recipe my mother passed down, the one with the secret pinch of orange zest that makes all the difference. The morning light filtered through my lace curtains, casting shadows that danced like ghosts of better times. I could almost smell my mother's apple pie from the old house on Ashland Avenue, almost hear her humming while she worked. "Evelyn," she used to say, "cooking is love made visible." But that Thanksgiving morning, as I stirred and seasoned and arranged, I wondered who would see that love, who would taste it with gratitude instead of obligation. My son Michael was supposed to arrive at 2 with his wife Jennifer and their 2 children. My daughters, Susan and Patricia, had their own plans. Susan was spending the holiday with her in-laws in Milwaukee, and Patricia was working a double shift at the hospital. It would just be Michael's family and me, and I had spent days planning every detail. I had polished the good silver, the set Harold and I received as a wedding gift in 1972. Each piece gleamed with the care I put into everything I did for my family. The tablecloth was Harold's favorite, deep burgundy with golden threads that caught the light just right. I arranged the centerpiece 3 times, wanting everything to be perfect, wanting to create the warmth and joy I remembered from holidays past. But when I think back now, I realize I was arranging more than flowers and candles. I was arranging my hopes, my desperate need to feel wanted, to feel like I still mattered in the lives of the people I had sacrificed everything for. The first sign something was wrong came in a text message at noon. Short, cold, efficient. "Running late. Don't wait dinner. Kids ate already." I stared at that message on my old phone, the one with the cracked screen that I kept meaning to replace but never did. Something inside me cracked too, a hairline fracture in what was left of my optimism. But I pushed the feeling down, as I always did. Maybe they were just busy. Maybe traffic was bad. Maybe I was overreacting, being too sensitive, as Michael often told me I was. They finally arrived at 4:30. By then, the turkey was dry, the rolls had cooled, and my enthusiasm had curdled like milk left in the sun. But I smiled, as I always did. I opened the door with arms ready for hugs that felt obligatory, brief, distracted. "Hi, Mom," Michael said, barely looking at me as he handed me his coat. Jennifer followed with a quick peck on my cheek, already checking her phone. The children, Emma, 12, and Jake, 9, rushed past me toward the television without a word of greeting. "How was your drive?" I asked, following them into my small living room where I had set up the fold-out table to accommodate everyone. "Fine," Michael replied, his voice flat, uninterested. He surveyed the room with eyes that seemed to catalog everything I had done wrong. "Mom, you really went overboard again." The criticism stung, but I swallowed it. I just wanted everything to be nice for the family. Jennifer was already helping herself to wine from the bottle I had opened specially, a good Pinot Noir that had cost me nearly $40, more than I usually spent on groceries for a week. "The kids are exhausted," she said without looking at me. "This whole formal dinner thing is really too much for them." I watched my grandchildren sprawled on my sofa, absorbed in their devices, and felt the familiar pang of disconnection. When had we stopped talking? When had family gatherings become endurance tests instead of celebrations? "Well," I said, forcing brightness into my voice, "dinner's ready whenever you are." We sat around that carefully set table, and I served plate after plate of food I had lovingly prepared. The turkey I had brined and basted for hours, The stuffing made from scratch with chestnuts and sage. The sweet potato casserole topped with pecans I had toasted myself. The cranberry sauce that took me 3 attempts to get just right. But the conversation was stilted, punctuated by the kids' complaints about having to put their phones away, and Jennifer's passive comments about the temperature of the food, the saltiness of the gravy, the fact that Emma was vegetarian now and couldn't eat most of what I had prepared. "I told you that last month, Mom," Michael said when I apologized for not knowing about Emma's dietary change. "You never listen." The words hit me like a physical blow. I never listen? I, who had spent decades hanging on every word my children spoke, who remembered every scraped knee and broken heart, every triumph and disappointment. I, who still called each of them every Sunday despite receiving increasingly brief and irritated responses. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice barely audible above the clinking of silverware. "I must have forgotten." "You forget a lot of things lately," Michael continued, his tone sharp with an impatience I didn't understand. "Maybe it's time to think about, getting some help, making some changes." The room fell silent except for the sound of Jake playing a game on his phone under the table. Jennifer's eyes met her husband's in a look I couldn't decipher but felt in my bones was somehow about me, about decisions being made without my knowledge. I excused myself to get the pies, pumpkin and apple, both made from scratch, and stood in my kitchen with tears burning behind my eyes. Through the thin wall, I could hear Michael's voice, low and irritated. "She's getting worse. Did you see how she set all this up? It's like she's trying too hard, It's embarrassing." Jennifer's response was muffled, but I caught enough. "Needs to face reality. Can't keep pretending." I gripped the edge of my counter, feeling the world shift beneath my feet like the unsteady ground after an earthquake. They were talking about me as if I weren't there, as if I were a problem to be solved rather than a person to be loved. When I returned with the desserts, Michael was checking his watch. "We should probably head out soon," he announced. "The kids have school tomorrow, and it's a long drive back." "But we haven't had dessert yet," I protested, setting down the pies I had spent the entire previous day making. "Maybe just a quick slice," Jennifer said, already standing up. "We're really stuffed." They ate their pie standing up in rushed bites, while I watched from my chair at the table still laden with food that would feed me for weeks. Food that was supposed to bring us together, that was supposed to matter, that was supposed to show them how much I loved them. As they gathered their coats and belongings, Michael turned to me with what I now recognize was a look of calculated cruelty. The family was clustered in my small entryway, everyone focused on leaving, when he delivered the blow that would change everything. "Mom," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, his voice carrying the kind of dismissive tone you'd use with a difficult child. "You really think we want you dragging your sad little stories here every year, making us sit through these performances?" He laughed then, cold and sharp and devastating. "I mean, look around. This whole setup, all this food nobody asked for, the guilt trips about family traditions. It's pathetic. We're adults with our own lives, and honestly, these little desperate gatherings are just embarrassing." The room went silent. Jennifer looked uncomfortable but said nothing. The children, still absorbed in their devices, seemed oblivious to the cruelty their father had just inflicted. But I felt it. I felt every word like a knife between my ribs. I held my smile, the same smile I had been wearing for months, for years, as my family grew more distant and dismissive. But inside, something cracked. Not just cracked, but shattered completely. The storm that had been building in my chest all day finally broke, and I felt rain that no one else could see or understand. Michael continued, emboldened by the silence. "Every holiday, it's the same thing. The fancy table, the guilt about family time, the way you make everyone feel bad if they can't stay as long as you want. Jennifer and I were talking, and we think maybe it's time for you to, I don't know, find some friends your own age. Stop depending on us for all your social needs." The word pathetic echoed in my mind long after they left. I stood in my doorway, watching their car disappear into the Chicago evening, and felt something inside me die. Not my love for them, that stubborn, foolish love that had sustained me through decades of marriage and motherhood, but my belief that it would ever be returned. I closed the door and leaned against it, surrounded by the remnants of my Thanksgiving feast. The house smelled like turkey and disappointment. The candles I had lit with such hope now flickered mockingly in the growing darkness. That night, I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by plates of untouched food and tried to make sense of what had happened. When had I become a burden? When had my love become something to be tolerated rather than cherished? When had the family I had devoted my life to become strangers who saw me as nothing more than an obligation, an embarrassment, a problem to be managed? I thought about Harold. gone now for 8 years, and wondered what he would say if he could see how his beloved family had fractured. Harold, who called me the glue that holds us all together. Harold, who would sit in this same kitchen and listen to me worry about the children, who would remind me that love sometimes means letting go, but never letting go of your own dignity. The memory of his warm hand on mine felt like a ghost touch, there and gone in an instant, but his words lingered. Evelyn, my dear, never let anyone convince you that your love isn't valuable, not even the people you love most. I had failed him, I realized. I had let them convince me that my love was worthless, that I was worthless. But sitting there in my quiet apartment, surrounded by the evidence of how much I cared, how much effort I had put into trying to keep us connected, I began to understand that the problem wasn't my love. It was how I had been giving it away without requiring anything in return. That Thanksgiving night was the beginning of everything that would follow. The beginning of questions I should have asked years ago. The beginning of boundaries I should have drawn decades ago. The beginning of the end of the woman I had been, and the birth of the woman I was finally ready to become. But change doesn't happen overnight, especially when you've spent a lifetime teaching people that your needs don't matter. The weeks that followed that devastating Thanksgiving were some of the darkest of my life, but they were also the beginning of my awakening. You see, I had been sacrificing myself for my family for so long that I had forgotten I was supposed to matter too. I had been so focused on being needed that I had never stopped to ask whether I was actually wanted. That night, staring at my reflection in my kitchen window, I finally began to see the woman I had become, tired, diminished, desperate for scraps of affection from people who saw me as nothing more than a convenience. Have you ever felt invisible in your own life? Have you ever given so much of yourself that there was nothing left to give? If you have, then you know the hollow ache I felt that night, the bone-deep exhaustion that comes from loving people who take your love for granted. But what I didn't know yet, what I couldn't see through my tears and disappointment, was that this was just the beginning of my story. The worst was yet to come, but so was the best. So was my redemption. So was my rebirth. The days following Thanksgiving blurred together in a haze of replaying that awful evening over and over in my mind. I kept hearing Michael's laugh, that cold, sharp sound that cut through me deeper than any argument ever could have. I found myself questioning everything I thought I knew about my family, about my role in their lives, about my own worth. I had given them everything. Everything. Let me tell you exactly what that means, because until you understand the depth of my sacrifice, you can't fully grasp the magnitude of their betrayal. When Harold died 8 years ago, I was left not just with grief, but with financial uncertainty. Harold had been the money manager in our marriage, an old-fashioned arrangement that left me vulnerable when I suddenly found myself alone. But instead of withdrawing into my grief, I threw myself into supporting my children. Michael's restaurant had failed within 2 years of opening. The debt was crushing, threatening to destroy his credit and his marriage. Without hesitation, I cashed in Harold's life insurance policy, $250,000 that was supposed to be my security in old age, and gave it all to Michael to pay off his creditors. "Mom, you're saving my life," he had said then, tears in his eyes as he hugged me tight. "I promise I'll pay you back every penny." That was 6 years ago. Not one penny had been returned, and the promises had stopped years ago. When I gently mentioned the debt last Christmas, Michael had snapped, "I thought that was a gift, not a loan. You can't give someone something and then hold it over their heads forever." But it wasn't just the money. When Jennifer went back to work after Jake was born, who took care of the baby 3 days a week for 2 years? Me. When Emma needed someone to pick her up from school every day because her parents worked late, who rearranged her entire schedule? Me. When Michael needed a place to store his business inventory after the restaurant closed, whose garage was suddenly filled with boxes of industrial kitchen equipment that stayed there for 3 years? Mine. I had been their emergency contact, their backup plan, their safety net. I had canceled plans, rearranged my life, ignored my own needs because family comes first. That's what I believed. That's what I had been taught, and that's what I taught my children by example. But somewhere along the way, my helpfulness became expected rather than appreciated. My sacrifices became invisible rather than valued. My love became a given rather than a gift. Susan, my middle daughter, had borrowed $15,000 2 years earlier when her husband lost his job. "Just until we get back on our feet," she had promised. When I called her the week after Thanksgiving to check in, really, if I'm honest, looking for some comfort after Michael's cruelty, she barely had time to talk. "Mom, I can't chat right now. The kids have soccer and I'm trying to get dinner started. Can I call you back?" She never called back. She never called back anymore unless she needed something. Patricia, my youngest, was different but somehow worse. She had become successful, a nurse practitioner with a good income and a new house in the suburbs. But her success had made her impatient with what she saw as my small problems and smaller life. "Mom, you need to stop dwelling on every little slight," she had told me the last time I tried to talk to her about feeling lonely. "Maybe if you got out more, joined some clubs or something, you wouldn't be so sensitive about family stuff." Sensitive. As if wanting basic respect and kindness from your own children was a character flaw. I began to see a pattern I had been too close to recognize before. Every interaction with my children followed the same script. They contacted me when they needed something: money, babysitting, emotional support, a place to store things, a ride to the airport. But when I needed something, company, conversation, help with my own problems, I was being needy, dramatic, too sensitive. The week after Thanksgiving, I decided to test this theory. I called each of my children and simply asked how they were doing, without offering anything or asking for anything specific. Just wanting to connect, to hear their voices, to feel like I mattered to them beyond what I could provide. Michael didn't answer. When he finally texted back 3 days later, it was brief. "Busy week. Talk later." Later never came. Susan answered, but immediately launched into her own problems without asking about mine. When I tried to interject with my own feelings, she said, "Oh, Mom, you know I can't deal with heavy stuff right now. I've got too much on my plate." Patricia was the worst. She answered with obvious irritation. "What's wrong now?" When I explained I just wanted to talk, she said, "Mom, I work 3 12-hour shifts. I don't have time for casual phone calls. If there's not an emergency, can we table this?" That week, I stopped answering the phone when they called. I needed to see what would happen, needed to understand if they would notice my absence or only notice when they needed something from me. The results were heartbreaking, but illuminating. Michael called twice, once to ask if I could watch Emma while Jennifer went to a spa weekend, and once to see if I could co-sign a loan for a new car. When I didn't answer, he left increasingly irritated voicemails. "Mom, why aren't you answering? This is important." Nothing about how I was doing. Nothing about whether I was okay. Just frustration that I wasn't available to serve his needs. Susan called once, looking for her grandmother's pearl necklace that she wanted to wear to a work party. When I didn't call back immediately, she sent a sharp text. "Mom, I know you're there. I need those pearls by Friday." Patricia didn't call at all. It was during this week of silence that I made a discovery that changed everything. I was going through old papers in Harold's desk, something I had been putting off for months, when I found a folder I had never seen before. Inside were financial documents, investment statements, and correspondence with a lawyer about Harold's estate. What I found made me physically sick. Harold had been far more financially successful than I had ever known. Beyond the life insurance policy I had given to Michael, there were stock investments worth nearly $500,000, a savings account I hadn't known existed with over $100,000, and most shocking of all, property investments that were generating rental income of over $3,000 per month. Harold had set all of this up to take care of me, to ensure I would never have to worry about money or depend on anyone. And I had never known because he had wanted it to be a surprise. A security blanket revealed only when I needed it. But here's the devastating part. The lawyer's letter, dated just weeks before Harold's death, outlined Harold's wishes for his estate. He wanted the rental properties to provide me with steady income. He wanted the investments to grow so I could leave something substantial to the grandchildren. He had even set aside money specifically for family emergencies, loans that could be made to the children if needed, with clear terms for repayment. Harold had planned for everything. He had tried to protect me from exactly the situation I had put myself in by giving away his life insurance money without understanding the full picture of our finances. The rental income had continued coming all these years, managed by the lawyer and deposited into an account I rarely checked because I thought it was just a small emergency fund. While I had been worrying about money, making do with Social Security and small savings, living frugally and denying myself basic comforts, I had been wealthy. All those years of Michael's emergencies, all those times I had said I couldn't afford to help Susan, all those moments when Patricia made me feel like a financial burden, I had been living a lie created by my own ignorance of my husband's careful planning. But the worst discovery was yet to come. In that folder was an email exchange from 3 years earlier between Michael and the family lawyer. Michael had been trying to get information about Harold's estate, claiming he needed to help me manage my affairs because I was getting confused about financial matters. The lawyer, thankfully, had refused to share any information without my explicit consent. But Michael's emails revealed a calculating side of my son I had never seen before. He wasn't just interested in helping me. He was interested in what he saw as his inheritance. He had been tracking my finances, trying to gain access to accounts I didn't even know I had. One email in particular made my blood run cold. My mother is clearly not capable of handling this kind of money. She's given away significant amounts to people who probably took advantage of her mental state. As her eldest child, I think I should have power of attorney to protect her remaining assets. The people who took advantage included a donation I had made to the church roof fund and a small gift to a neighbor whose husband was battling cancer. Michael was characterizing my normal, reasonable generosity as evidence of mental incompetence. That night, I sat in my kitchen with Harold's financial documents spread across the table and wept, not just from sadness, but from rage. I had been living like a poor woman while my children treated me like a burden, never knowing that Harold had ensured I would never need to depend on anyone. More than that, I realized that Michael hadn't been grateful for the life insurance money I gave him. He had been angry that I had wasted part of what he already considered his inheritance. His coldness, his dismissiveness, his cruel words at Thanksgiving, they all made horrible sense now. I wasn't a mother to him anymore. I was an obstacle between him and money he felt entitled to. That revelation was followed by another disturbing discovery. Going through more of Harold's papers, I found a file labeled Family Vacation Property. Inside were documents for a small villa in Oak Park, a charming 3-bedroom house with a garden that Harold had bought as an investment and always planned to give to the family as a vacation home. Because I had never known about this property, the management had continued under the lawyer's supervision. It had been rented out for years, generating income that supported its maintenance and taxes. It was mortgage-free, worth approximately $400,000, and according to Harold's wishes, was supposed to be transferred to my name upon his death, with the understanding that it would eventually be inherited by all 3 of my children equally. But here's where the story gets even worse. The lawyer's notes indicated that Michael had contacted him multiple times over the past 2 years, asking about this property specifically. Somehow, Michael had learned about the house, possibly through public records or through contacts in the restaurant business, since Oak Park has a thriving food scene. In his most recent email to the lawyer, sent just 1 month before Thanksgiving, Michael had written, "I assume when my mother passes, this property will go directly to me as the eldest son. I'd like to start making plans for it. Can you send me the keys and management contact?" The lawyer had responded appropriately, explaining that the property was mine to do with as I wished, and that Harold's will specified equal inheritance among all 3 children only after my death. But Michael's assumption that he had first claim on family assets, that my death was just an inconvenience delaying his inheritance, left me breathless with betrayal. As I pieced together the full picture of my financial situation and my family's knowledge of it, I began to understand that their treatment of me wasn't just thoughtless cruelty. It was calculated manipulation designed to make me feel dependent and grateful for scraps of attention while they positioned themselves to benefit from assets they believed should rightfully be theirs. That night, I called the lawyer, a kind man named Mr. Peterson who had known Harold for decades, and made an appointment to meet the following week. For the first time in 8 years, I was going to take control of my own life. But first, I had to confront the emotional devastation of realizing that my children, the babies I had nursed and raised and sacrificed for, saw me not as a person worthy of love and respect, but as an aging obstacle to their financial security. Have you ever looked at your own children and realized you didn't recognize them anymore? Have you ever discovered that your love, your sacrifice, your entire adult life has been reduced to nothing more than a balance sheet in someone else's mind? The grief of that realization was almost unbearable, but it was also the beginning of my anger. And anger, I was about to discover, could be far more powerful than grief. The days following my discovery passed in a strange combination of clarity and numbness. I kept going through the motions of my daily routine, morning coffee, grocery shopping, evening news, but everything felt different now that I understood the truth about my family's motivations and my own financial security. I found myself looking at my apartment with new eyes. The frugal choices I had made, buying generic groceries, wearing the same winter coat for 5 years, keeping the thermostat low to save money, all of it had been unnecessary. While I had been scrimp and saving, worried about being a burden, I had been wealthier than I realized and more generous than my children deserved. But what hurt most wasn't the money. It was the cold calculation behind their behavior. Every family gathering I had analyzed in my memory took on new meaning when viewed through the lens of their true feelings about me. Last Christmas, when Michael had made that comment about me going overboard with gifts, I now understood it wasn't about the expense or the excess. It was about his irritation that I was spending his inheritance on presents. When Susan had suggested I might want to downsize to something smaller and cheaper than my current apartment, she wasn't concerned about my well-being. She was concerned about preserving the estate she expected to inherit, Patricia's constant advice about finding friends my own age and joining senior activities wasn't about my social life. It was about reducing my dependence on them so they could minimize their contact with me while still maintaining their claim on my eventual assets. I began to see how systematically they had been managing me, keeping me just grateful enough to continue their access to financial help when needed, but isolated enough that I wouldn't become too much of a burden on their daily lives. The week before my appointment with Mr. Peterson, I did something I hadn't done in years. I went shopping for myself. Really shopping, not just buying necessities. I went to a nice department store in downtown Chicago and bought a new winter coat, a beautiful deep blue wool coat that fit perfectly and made me feel elegant instead of invisible. The saleswoman, a younger woman probably in her 40s, was kind and attentive. As she rang up my purchase, she said, "This color is perfect on you. Are you shopping for something special?" "I'm shopping for a new life," I told her, and realized as I said it that it was true. That evening, I called my old friend Dorothy, someone I had lost touch with over the past few years as I became more absorbed in trying to maintain relationships with my increasingly distant children. "Evelyn!" Dorothy's voice was warm with genuine pleasure. "I was just thinking about you. How have you been?" For the first time in months, someone asked about me because they actually cared about the answer. I found myself talking for over an hour, telling Dorothy everything. Harold's estate, the children's behavior, my growing awareness that I had been living far below my means both financially and emotionally. "Honey," Dorothy said when I finished, "what took you so long to see what the rest of us have been watching for years?" "What do you mean?" "Your kids have been treating you like an ATM with legs for as long as I've known you. Every time we used to get together, it was Michael needs this, Susan needs that, Patricia said this. When did they ever ask what you needed?" Dorothy's words stung because they were true. Even in my friendships, I had become someone who only talked about my children's needs and problems, never my own hopes and dreams. I had made myself into a supporting character in my own life. "It's not too late," Dorothy continued. "You're 73, not 93. You could have 20 good years ahead of you if you stop giving them all away to people who don't appreciate them." That night, I made a list. At the top, I wrote what I want. It was such a foreign concept that I stared at the blank paper for nearly an hour before I could write a single word. When the words finally came, they surprised me. I want to travel somewhere warm. I want to learn to paint. I want to read books without feeling guilty about the time. I want to wake up without anxiety about who needs what from me today. I want to feel valued for who I am, not what I can provide. I want to stop apologizing for taking up space in the world. I want to be around people who light up when they see me, not people who see me as a problem to be managed. The list went on for 2 pages. Dreams I had buried so deeply I had forgotten they existed. Hopes I had pushed aside because someone else's needs always seemed more important. At the bottom of the list, I wrote something that scared me even as I wrote it. I want to stop loving people who don't love me back. My appointment with Mr. Peterson was scheduled for the following Tuesday. But before I could take control of my financial life, I needed to understand exactly where I stood with my children. I needed to test whether there was any genuine love left beneath all the manipulation and calculation. So I decided to run an experiment. I would stop all financial support immediately and see what happened. No more emergency loans, no more co-signing, no more helping out with bills or car payments or unexpected expenses. I would become financially unavailable and see if I became emotionally invisible as well. The test began the very next day. Susan called, sounding stressed and urgent. "Mom, I hate to ask, but Emma needs a new laptop for school. The one she has is ancient, and she's falling behind because it keeps crashing. Could you help us out? We're looking at maybe $800 for something decent." In the past, I would have immediately asked where to send the check. This time, I took a breath and said, "I'm sorry, Susan, but I'm not in a position to help financially right now." The silence on the other end stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. "What do you mean you're not in a position to help?" Susan's voice had gone cold. "I'm not asking for thousands of dollars. It's for Emma's education. I understand, and I'm sorry. I just can't help financially right now." "Mom, what's going on with you? Are you having money problems? Because if you are, maybe we need to talk about getting you some help managing your finances." There it was. The suggestion that I was incompetent, that I needed management rather than respect. The same tactic Michael had used with the lawyer. "I'm fine," I said. "I'm just not giving out loans anymore." Susan's tone became sharp, accusing. "Loans? I never thought of help from my mother as loans. That's really cold, Mom. I mean, if you can't help your own granddaughter with something as basic as a computer for school." She was trying to make me feel guilty, trying to reframe my perfectly reasonable boundary as selfishness. But instead of caving as I usually did, I felt my resolve strengthen. Emma is a smart girl. I'm sure you and Patricia will figure something out. Patricia? Why would I ask Patricia when you've always been the one who helps with things like this? Because, I wanted to say, Patricia has a good job and her own money, while I'm the retired person on a fixed income who has been subsidizing all of you for years. Instead, I simply repeated, I'm not in a position to help financially right now. The conversation ended awkwardly, with Susan's hurt feelings barely concealed behind a brittle politeness. 20 minutes later, she sent a text. I don't know what's gotten into you lately, but this isn't like you. I hope you get back to being yourself soon. Being myself. As if being myself meant being an open checkbook for other people's problems. 2 days later, Michael called. This time the emergency was car trouble. The transmission was going out and the repair would cost $3,000. Mom, I hate to ask, but we're really stuck. Jennifer's car is in the shop too, and we both need vehicles to get to work. Could you help us out? I know it's a lot, but we're talking about our livelihood here. Again, I said no. Again, the silence was long and cold. No? Michael's voice was incredulous. Mom, what do you mean no? This isn't optional. I have to get to work. I understand it's difficult, Michael, but I'm not giving out money for emergencies anymore. Not giving out money? Mom, are you okay? This is your son, your family. We're not random people asking for handouts. The word handouts stung because it revealed exactly how he saw my help, not as love or generosity, but as something he was entitled to receive without question. I know you're my family, I said quietly, and because you're my family, I trust you'll figure out a solution that doesn't involve me. Michael's voice turned ugly then, in a way I had never heard before. I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but it stops now. You don't get to suddenly act like you don't care about your family just because you're having some kind of senior moment. Senior moment. Another suggestion that my perfectly rational decision was evidence of mental decline. I care about my family very much, I said. That's why I'm not enabling you to continue avoiding responsibility for your own problems. The word enabling came out before I could stop it, and I could hear Michael's sharp intake of breath. It was the truth, but it was also a declaration of war. Enabling? His voice was furious now. You call helping your family enabling? You call being a decent mother enabling? You know what, Mom? Never mind. Don't help. We'll figure it out ourselves. Like we apparently should have been doing all along instead of counting on you. The call ended with him hanging up on me. An hour later, I received a text that made my hands shake. Maybe Patricia was right. Maybe you do need to think about assisted living if you're going to start making decisions that don't make sense. Assisted living? They had been discussing assisted living, not because I needed physical care or had dementia, but because I had dared to say no to a financial request. The mask was finally off. The loving son who had hugged me and promised to pay back the life insurance money was gone, replaced by someone who saw me as a problem to be managed, a resource to be controlled, an obstacle to his financial security. That night, I called Dorothy again. They're showing you exactly who they are, she said after I told her about the conversations. Believe them. But they're my children, I whispered, the words breaking on the way out. How did I raise children who would treat me this way? Honey, you didn't raise them to be this way, but you trained them that you would accept it. There's a difference. Dorothy was right. For years, I had rewarded their disrespect with continued generosity. I had taught them that they could treat me badly and still receive everything they wanted from me. I had confused love with enabling, boundaries with selfishness, self-respect with being a difficult mother. But understanding how I had contributed to the dynamic didn't make it hurt less. These were the babies I had held, the children I had bandaged and comforted and cheered for. These were the people I had loved more than my own life, and they were treating me like an inconvenience, a broken-down ATM, a burden. The third test came from Patricia 3 days later. She didn't ask for money. Patricia never asked for money directly. Instead, she called with a different kind of manipulation. Mom, I'm concerned about you. Susan told me about the conversation you had, and Michael said you hung up on him when he called about a legitimate emergency. This isn't like you. Are you feeling depressed? Are you having problems with your medication? There it was again. The suggestion that my reasonable boundaries were symptoms of illness or mental decline. I'm feeling fine, Patricia. Better than I have in years, actually. Well, that's good to hear. But your behavior suggests otherwise. Mom, when family members need help and you just refuse to help, that's concerning. It suggests either depression or some kind of cognitive issue. I took a deep breath and said something I had never said to any of my children. What's concerning to me is that none of you have asked how I'm doing. You've only called when you needed something, And when I said no, your first assumption was that something is wrong with me rather than something being wrong with how you've been treating me. The silence stretched so long I thought she had hung up. Finally, Patricia spoke, and her voice was careful, controlled. Mom, I think we need to have a family meeting, all of us, to discuss your situation, my situation, as if I were the problem, as if their selfish behavior and financial manipulation were secondary to my mental state. What situation is that, Patricia? Your isolation, your sudden hostility toward family members who are trying to help, your irrational financial decisions. Mom, we love you, but we can't enable destructive behavior. Enable destructive behavior. She had turned the situation completely around, making my healthy boundary setting into destructive behavior that they needed to prevent. I don't think a family meeting is necessary, I said. But if you want to have one, that's up to you. It's not up to me, Mom. It's up to all of us to make sure you're safe and making good decisions. We have a responsibility to protect you, even if you can't see that you need protection. Protect me. From what? From making my own choices about my own money? From expecting basic respect from my own children? After that conversation, I knew there was no going back. The children I had loved and sacrificed for saw me as incompetent at best, a resource to be managed at worst. They were already discussing ways to override my decisions, to take control of my life, for my own good. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I called Mr. Peterson and moved my appointment up to the next day. It was time to take control of my finances, my property, and most importantly, my life. But I also knew that what was coming would be the hardest thing I had ever done, because loving someone doesn't stop just because they stop deserving it. And the pain of seeing your children's true feelings isn't something you prepare for, even when you know it's coming. The next morning, I put on my new blue coat and walked out into the Chicago winter air with more confidence than I had felt in years. I was about to become a different person, someone who valued herself enough to demand respect, someone who understood that love without boundaries is not love at all. Have you ever reached a moment where you realized that protecting other people from the consequences of their actions was actually destroying both of you? Have you ever had to choose between being loved and being respected, only to discover that you can't truly have either without both? My transformation was about to begin. But first, I had to demolish everything I thought I knew about family, love, and my own worth. My meeting with Mr. Peterson changed everything I thought I knew about my life and my options. Walking into his downtown Chicago office that cold Tuesday morning, I felt like a woman preparing for surgery, terrified of the pain, but desperate for the healing that could follow. Mr. Peterson was a distinguished man in his 70s with kind eyes and the patient manner of someone who had spent decades helping people navigate life's most difficult transitions. Harold had trusted him completely, and sitting in his warm, book-lined office, I began to understand why. Mrs. Thompson, he said after we had settled with coffee, I have to tell you, I've been hoping you would come see me for years. Harold was very specific about his wishes for your financial security, and I've watched with concern as you've struggled unnecessarily. I didn't know, I said simply. Harold handled all the finances. I trusted him completely, but I never learned the details. Harold wanted to protect you from having to worry about money, but I think he also wanted to surprise you with how well he had provided for your future. He was very proud of his investments and very excited about ensuring you would be comfortable. Mr. Peterson spread out documents across his large mahogany desk, and for the next 2 hours, he walked me through the full extent of Harold's estate. The numbers were staggering. Beyond the life insurance money I had given to Michael, there were stock investments worth over $600,000. The savings account I had barely touched contained $140,000. The rental properties were generating monthly income of $3,800, which had been accumulating in a separate account for 8 years. Mrs. Thompson, you haven't just been financially secure all these years. You've been wealthy. The rental income alone is more than many people's full-time salaries. But the most shocking discovery was yet to come. Harold had also purchased several acres of land outside Chicago in the early 2000s, when prices were low. That land, now surrounded by suburban development, was worth nearly $1 million. Your husband was quite the investor, Mr. Peterson said with admiration. He saw the potential for growth in that area long before anyone else did. Between all your assets, Mrs. Thompson, you're worth approximately $2.5 million. I stared at him in disbelief. $2.5 million. While I had been worrying about grocery bills and heating costs, while my children had been treating me like a financial burden, I had been wealthier than most people could dream of being. Why didn't I know any of this? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Harold set it up so that everything would be managed automatically. He wanted you to have the income without the stress of managing investments or dealing with tenants. He thought he would have time to explain it all to you when he retired. Mr. Peterson's voice was gentle. He never imagined he would die so suddenly, so young. Harold had been 70 when he died of a massive heart attack. Not young by most standards, but too young to execute all his plans for our golden years together. There's something else, Mr. Peterson continued. Harold left very specific instructions about the estate. He wanted you to have complete control over everything during your lifetime, but he also left detailed wishes about inheritance. He handed me a sealed envelope with my name written in Harold's familiar handwriting. He wanted you to read this only when you were ready to make decisions about the future. I think today might be that day. With shaking hands, I opened the envelope and unfolded Harold's letter. His words, written in his careful script, reached across the years to comfort me. My dearest Evelyn, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and you've finally discovered the extent of what I was able to build for us. I hope it brings you joy, not anxiety. Every investment, every property, every dollar was earned thinking about our future together and your security when I was no longer there to take care of you. But more than that, I hope these resources give you the freedom to live exactly as you choose. You've spent our entire marriage taking care of everyone else. Me, the children, anyone who needed help. Now I want you to take care of yourself. The children are adults now with their own lives and opportunities. Help them if it brings you joy, but never feel obligated to sacrifice your own comfort for theirs. You've already given them the most valuable gifts possible. Your love, your values, your example of how to live with dignity and kindness. The house in Oak Park is yours to enjoy. I bought it dreaming of quiet weekends there with you, morning coffee on the back porch, reading in the garden. But if you prefer, rent it out or sell it or give it away. It's yours to do with as you please. Most importantly, my love, remember that your worth has never been measured by what you could give other people. You are valuable because you exist, because you are the woman I loved for 43 years, because you made every day of my life brighter just by being in it. Be happy, Evelyn. Be selfish if you need to be. Be independent. Be exactly who you want to be. All my love always, Harold. I sat in Mr. Peterson's office and cried. Not from sadness this time, but from relief. Harold had known. Somehow he had known that I would need permission to value myself, that I would need his voice from beyond the grave to give me courage to claim my own life. Mrs. Thompson, Mr. Peterson said gently after I had composed myself, there's one more thing we need to discuss. Your son Michael has been in contact with this office multiple times over the past few years. He showed me the email exchanges I had found at home, plus several more recent communications. Most recently, he's been asking about power of attorney options and suggesting that you might need assistance managing your affairs. He's also specifically asked about the Oak Park property and when it might be available. The cold calculation in Michael's emails was even worse when viewed in the context of my actual financial situation. He wasn't concerned about my welfare. He was concerned about his access to assets he considered his inheritance. Mr. Peterson, I want to make some changes. Over the next hour, we restructured everything. I took control of all accounts, ensuring that no one could access them without my explicit consent. I arranged for the Oak Park property to be transferred immediately into my name alone. I set up a new will that would protect my assets according to my wishes, not anyone else's assumptions. Most importantly, I established what Mr. Peterson called fortress boundaries around my finances. Legal structures that would prevent anyone from claiming I was incompetent or needed oversight unless I truly developed severe dementia or similar conditions. Mrs. Thompson, Mr. Peterson said as we concluded our business, I have to ask, what changed your mind about managing your finances directly? For years, you seemed content to let things continue as Harold had set them up. I thought about how to answer that question. How do you explain that your own children's cruelty had finally broken through decades of self-sacrifice and people-pleasing? I realized that I was living far below my means in every area of my life. I said finally, financially, emotionally, spiritually. It was time to claim what was actually mine. Walking out of Mr. Peterson's office, I felt like a different woman. Not just because I now understood my financial security, but because I had taken action to protect myself. For the first time in my adult life, I had put my own needs first. But I also knew that the hardest part was still ahead of me. My children had revealed their true feelings about me, and now I had to decide how to respond to that knowledge. That afternoon, I drove to Oak Park to see the house Harold had bought for us. It was a charming Victorian with a wraparound porch and a garden that, even in winter, showed signs of being lovingly maintained by the property management company. I walked through rooms Harold had never seen, imagining the quiet weekends he had dreamed of. the morning coffees on the back porch he had mentioned in his letter. The house felt like a gift from beyond the grave. Not just the financial value, but the reminder that someone had loved me enough to plan carefully for my future happiness. In the master bedroom, I found myself standing in front of a large mirror, really looking at myself for the first time in years. I saw a woman who had lived 73 years, who had survived the death of her husband and the betrayal of her children. I saw someone who was still here, still standing, still capable of joy and growth and change. That evening, I called Dorothy and told her everything about the meeting with Mr. Peterson. $2.5 million? Dorothy's voice was incredulous. Evelyn, do you realize what this means? You don't have to take anyone's crap ever again. You don't have to worry about being abandoned or cut off or needing help from people who treat you badly. You're free. Free. I had been free all along and never known it. But freedom, I was about to learn, is only valuable if you're willing to use it. And using it meant making the hardest decisions of my life about the people I loved most, even when they had stopped loving me back. The next few weeks were a period of careful observation and painful clarity. Now that I understood my true financial situation and had stopped responding to my children's demands for money, their behavior toward me crystallized into something I could no longer ignore or rationalize away. Michael's calls stopped entirely. When I tried calling him to simply talk, he answered with barely concealed irritation. "Mom, I can't chat right now. Things are really tight since you decided to cut us off financially, and I'm working extra hours to make ends meet." Cut off financially. As if my money had been their money all along. "I didn't cut you off, Michael. I just stopped giving loans." "Same thing," he said coldly. "Same thing." Susan became passive-aggressive in a way that was almost worse than Michael's direct hostility. She would answer my calls, but with a martyred tone that made every conversation feel like I was inconveniencing her. "Oh, hi, Mom. I suppose you're calling to see how we're managing without your help." Well, Emma's still using her old laptop, which crashed twice during her history presentation. But I guess that's just how it is now. Every conversation became an opportunity for her to detail the hardships my newfound boundaries were causing, as if I were responsible not just for their current problems, but for every difficulty they might face in the future. Patricia took a different approach. She began what I now recognize as a campaign to have me declared mentally incompetent. She started calling regularly, but not to check on me, to test me. She would ask detailed questions about my daily activities, my finances, my health. She would repeat questions from previous calls to see if my answers remained consistent. She began showing up unexpectedly to check on me, really to observe my living conditions and mental state. "Mom, I noticed you have a new coat. That seems like an expensive purchase for someone on a fixed income. Are you sure you can afford it? Mom, you missed church last Sunday. Is everything okay? Are you having trouble keeping track of your schedule? Mom, I saw you talking to that man from down the hall. You need to be careful about strangers trying to take advantage of elderly people living alone." Every choice I made, every purchase, every social interaction was scrutinized for signs of incompetence or poor judgment. Patricia had appointed herself as my unofficial guardian, ready to step in and protect me from my own decisions. The worst part was realizing that they had probably been discussing my supposed decline for months, maybe years. Comments I had missed or dismissed as concern now revealed themselves as evidence gathering for a case they were building against my autonomy. One particularly awful evening, I overheard a three-way phone call between my children. I had called Michael, and because of what seemed like a technical glitch, I could hear Susan and Patricia on the line as well, though they clearly didn't know I was listening. "She's definitely getting worse," Patricia was saying. "The spending, the hostility toward family, the paranoia about money, these are classic signs." "I knew something was wrong when she started refusing to help us," Susan added. "That's just not Mom. Mom always puts family first." Michael's voice was cold and calculating. "The question is, how long do we wait before we do something about it? I mean, she could drain everything while we're trying to be respectful of her independence." They were talking about me as if I were already dead, as if my money were already theirs, as if my autonomy were a problem to be solved rather than a right to be respected. "What did Dr. Martinez say?" Susan asked. Dr. Martinez, that would be Patricia's boss at the medical clinic. Had Patricia been discussing my supposed mental decline with her supervisor? She said if we can document enough incidents of poor judgment, we might be able to get emergency conservatorship, especially if there's evidence of financial mismanagement or self-neglect. "What counts as financial mismanagement?" Michael asked. "Giving away large sums inappropriately, making purchases that don't align with her actual needs, failing to pay bills on time. The usual signs of dementia-related decision-making problems. Giving away large sums inappropriately, like the life insurance money I had given to Michael to save his failing business. They were planning to use my own generosity as evidence of incompetence. I think our best bet is to document everything and wait for a really clear incident of poor judgment, Patricia continued. Something obvious enough that a judge would see the need for intervention. How long could that take? Michael's impatience was evident. Could be weeks, could be months. But in the meantime, we need to make sure she doesn't do anything irreversible. Like change her will or transfer property or anything like that. Too late, I thought, remembering my meeting with Mr. Peterson. As I listened to my children plan to have me declared incompetent so they could control my money, I felt something inside me harden into a resolve I had never experienced before. This wasn't disappointment or sadness. This was ice-cold anger. These people, whom I had loved more than my own life, were actively plotting to take away my freedom. They saw my mental health not as something to be protected, but as an obstacle to be overcome. They were willing to have me declared legally incompetent, a humiliating, devastating process that would strip away my basic rights as an adult, because I had dared to say no to their financial demands. That night, I made a decision that would have been impossible for the woman I had been 6 months earlier. I was going to fight back, not just by setting boundaries or refusing to give money, but by actively protecting myself from people who saw me as prey. The next morning, I called Mr. Peterson and scheduled another appointment. I also contacted a different attorney, one who specialized in elder law and protection from financial abuse by family members. Mrs. Thompson, the elder law attorney, Ms. Chen, said after I explained the situation, "What you're describing is unfortunately very common. Family members often justify financial manipulation by claiming concern for an elderly relative's mental capacity. But I'm not incompetent," I protested. "I'm making rational decisions based on reasonable boundaries. I know that, and any objective evaluation would show that. But the legal system sometimes struggles to distinguish between genuine cognitive decline and family displeasure with an elderly person's choices. We need to create a paper trail that clearly documents your mental competency and the true motivations behind your children's concerns." We spent 2 hours developing what Ms. Chen called a protection plan, detailed psychological evaluations to establish my competency, documentation of my children's financial motivations, legal structures to prevent emergency conservatorship proceedings, character witnesses who could testify to my sound judgment. Mrs. Thompson, I have to warn you, fighting this kind of family manipulation often means accepting that relationships will be permanently damaged. Are you prepared for that? I thought about Harold's letter, about his encouragement to be selfish if I needed to be independent, to be exactly who I wanted to be. Ms. Chen, those relationships were already damaged. I just hadn't admitted it yet. But even as I prepared to legally protect myself from my own children, I struggled with grief that felt almost physical. How do you mourn people who are still alive? How do you grieve the loss of relationships that were apparently never what you thought they were? That weekend, I did something I hadn't done in years. I went to a movie by myself. A romantic comedy that made me laugh out loud, surrounded by strangers who didn't need anything from me, who didn't see me as a problem to be managed or a resource to be controlled. Walking out of that theater, I realized I hadn't enjoyed myself that much in months, maybe years. When had I stopped doing things simply because they brought me pleasure? The answer was depressing. I had stopped living for myself sometime in the distant past, so gradually that I hadn't noticed my own life disappearing under the weight of other people's needs and expectations. But I was starting to get it back. And the more I reclaimed my own life, the more clearly I could see how much I had given away. Not just money, but dignity, autonomy, joy. My children had taken all of it, and now they wanted to take the rest. But I was done giving. It was time to start taking back what was mine. The planning and legal preparation took several weeks, during which my children continued their campaign to document my supposed incompetence. Patricia showed up twice more for surprise visits, ostensibly to check on my well-being, but clearly to observe and assess. During her second visit, she brought a small notebook and was obviously taking notes about our conversation. When I asked her about it, she claimed she was tracking my health concerns to help coordinate your care. I don't need care coordination, Patricia. I'm fine. Mom, that's exactly the kind of thing someone with cognitive issues would say. Denial is one of the early signs. The circular logic was maddening. Every assertion of my competence became evidence of incompetence. Every reasonable decision became a symptom of declining judgment. But Patricia's visits also gave me opportunities to demonstrate exactly how sharp my thinking remained. I began pulling out financial documents, showing her my organized filing system, discussing current events and complex topics with obvious clarity and insight. "You seem very focused on money lately, Mom," she observed during one visit. "That's concerning. Obsessing about finances can be a sign of anxiety or depression. I'm not obsessing, Patricia. I'm taking responsibility. There's a difference. Taking responsibility for what? You've never needed to worry about complicated financial decisions before. Dad handled all that. Dad's been gone for 8 years. It's time I understood my own situation. Patricia's expression was calculating, and I could almost see her mental notes. Patient shows unusual interest in financial matters previously managed by deceased spouse. Claims of independence potentially mask underlying confusion. The family meeting I had been dreading was finally scheduled for the Saturday before Christmas. Michael had called to announce it with the tone of someone delivering an ultimatum. Mom, we need to sit down and discuss your situation. All of us. This has gone on long enough. What situation is that, Michael? You know exactly what situation. The hostility, the irrational decisions, the way you've been treating your family. We love you too much to let you continue down this path. The meeting was set for my apartment, which I realized was strategic. They wanted to see my living conditions, to observe my daily environment for signs of neglect or poor judgment. I spent the week before that meeting preparing, both legally and emotionally. Ms. Chen had coached me on what to expect and how to respond. Mr. Peterson had provided documentation of my financial competency. Dorothy had offered to be present as a witness, but I decided I needed to face this alone. The morning of the meeting, I put on my best dress, a navy blue outfit I had bought for special occasions but rarely worn. I arranged fresh flowers on my dining table and made sure my apartment was spotlessly clean and organized. If they were looking for evidence of self-neglect or declining abilities, they wouldn't find it. Susan arrived first, followed by Patricia, then Michael. They arranged themselves around my dining table with the formal air of people conducting business rather than family having a conversation. Michael, as the eldest, took charge. Mom, we asked for this meeting because we're concerned about you. Over the past few months, you've been acting differently, making decisions that don't seem like you, treating family members with hostility, becoming isolated and suspicious. I listened to his prepared speech and marveled at how completely he had reframed the situation. In his version, their financial manipulation became family support. My boundary setting became hostility. My growing independence became suspicious isolation. We think you might be experiencing some cognitive changes, Patricia added in her professional voice. Memory problems, poor judgment, difficulty managing complex decisions. These things are normal parts of aging, but they require intervention. What kind of intervention? I asked calmly. Susan jumped in. We think you need help managing your daily life. Someone to assist with finances, medical decisions, maybe even living arrangements. We want to make sure you're safe. Safe. The same word they had used to justify overriding my autonomy, controlling my money, managing my life. I feel very safe, I said. In fact, I feel safer than I have in years. The three of them exchanged glances, the kind of look that passed between people who had already discussed how to handle my expected responses. Michael pulled out a folder. Mom, we've been documenting some concerning behaviors. The refusal to help Emma with her laptop, the way you hung up on me during a legitimate emergency, the expensive purchases that don't align with your actual income. What expensive purchases? The new coat, for one. Mom, that coat cost over $300. That's not a reasonable expense for someone on a fixed income. I almost laughed. $300 was less than I now knew I could afford to spend on lunch every day for a year. But in their minds, any purchase that wasn't strictly necessary was evidence of poor judgment. I can afford the coat, Michael. Patricia leaned forward with fake concern. Mom, that's exactly what we're worried about. You seem to have lost perspective about money. Dad always handled the finances because that kind of thinking wasn't your strength. Now that you're trying to manage complex financial decisions alone, you're making choices that could put your future security at risk. The condescension was breathtaking. They were suggesting that I had always been too stupid to understand money, that Harold had managed our finances because I was incompetent, rather than because we had divided responsibilities in the traditional way of our generation. My financial decisions are sound, I said firmly. I have a complete understanding of my resources and my expenses. Susan shook her head sadly. Mom, you gave Michael Dad's entire life insurance policy. That shows you don't really understand the value of money or the importance of financial security. There it was. They were using my generosity as evidence of incompetence. The same generosity they had gratefully accepted and never questioned when it benefited them. I understood exactly what I was doing when I helped Michael with his business debt. But that kind of decision, Patricia pressed, giving away hundreds of thousands of dollars without proper consideration of your own long-term needs, that's exactly the kind of financial mismanagement that concerns us. Michael's voice became harder, more demanding. Mom, we need you to agree to let us help manage your affairs. Patricia can handle your medical decisions, Susan can help with daily living arrangements, and I can take over the financial management. It's not a punishment, it's protection. They had it all figured out. Patricia would control my health care, Susan would control my living situation, and Michael would control my money. Among the three of them, they would own every aspect of my life. And if I don't agree? I asked. The silence that followed was heavy with threat. Finally, Patricia spoke in her most professional tone. Mom, if you can't recognize that you need help, that itself is evidence of impaired judgment. We have documentation of concerning behaviors, financial mismanagement, and social isolation. If necessary, we can petition for emergency conservatorship. Emergency conservatorship. The legal mechanism that would allow them to override my wishes and control my life based on their claims of my incompetence. I looked at my 3 children, the babies I had nursed and raised, the people I had sacrificed everything for, and saw strangers, worse than strangers. Strangers wouldn't have the intimate knowledge of my vulnerabilities that they were using against me. Strangers wouldn't be able to wound me as deeply with their betrayal. I see, I said quietly. Michael's expression softened slightly, perhaps thinking I was ready to capitulate. Mom, we're doing this because we love you. We want to make sure you're taken care of, like a possession, like something broken that needed fixing. I stood up from the table and walked to my bedroom, leaving them sitting in confused silence. From my dresser drawer, I retrieved the folder Ms. Chen had prepared for me. When I returned to the dining room, I placed the folder in the center of the table. What's this? Susan asked. Documentation, I said calmly. Psychological evaluations showing my complete mental competency. Financial statements proving my sound judgment and secure position. Legal documentation establishing my right to make my own decisions without interference. I watched their faces as I continued. I also have statements from witnesses who can testify to my mental sharpness, character references from people who know me well, and most importantly, detailed records of this conversation and others where you've discussed having me declared incompetent in order to access my finances. Patricia's face went pale. Mom, You never what? Never discussed my supposed mental decline with your supervisor? Never planned to use my generosity to Michael as evidence of financial mismanagement? Never coordinated a campaign to document my alleged incompetence? The silence was deafening. I opened the folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. A copy of the deed to the Oak Park house with Michael's name crossed out in red ink. This, I said, placing the deed in front of Michael, is what you've really been worried about, isn't it? Not my mental health, not my safety, my assets. Michael's face flushed red. That house was supposed to be family property. It is family property. My family property. Harold left it to me, not to you. Susan found her voice. Mom, you're being unreasonable. We're your children. We have a right to be concerned about your welfare. You have a right to be concerned, I agreed. But you don't have a right to control me. And you certainly don't have a right to take away my autonomy because I stopped giving you money. Patricia tried one more professional intervention. Mom, this defensiveness, this paranoia about our motivations, these are concerning symptoms. You're proving our point about your declining judgment. I looked at my youngest daughter and felt the last remnants of my maternal patience evaporate. Patricia, you're a healthcare professional. You know the difference between declining judgment and justified anger. You know the difference between paranoia and realistic assessment of threat. What you're doing isn't medical concern, it's psychological manipulation. I walked to my front door and opened it. This meeting is over. You've made your position clear, and I've made mine clear. You can accept my boundaries and work on rebuilding respectful relationships with me, or you can continue down this path and lose me entirely. Michael stood up, his face dark with anger. You can't just cut off your family, Mom. We won't let you destroy yourself. Destroy myself? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Michael, for the first time in years, I'm building myself up. I'm living in my own house, making my own decisions, surrounding myself with people who value me. If that looks like destruction to you, it's because you've benefited from my previous self-neglect. They filed out of my apartment one by one, their faces arrangements of hurt feelings and righteous indignation, but I could see the calculation behind their expressions. This wasn't over. I had won this battle, but the war for my autonomy was just beginning. As I closed the door behind them, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades. The peace that comes from knowing that you've defended yourself against people who wanted to harm you, even when those people are your own children. But I also felt grief that went deeper than any I had experienced since Harold's death. Because Harold's death had been a tragedy, a loss of something beautiful. This was the death of an illusion, the recognition that something I thought was beautiful had actually been slowly killing me for years. That night, I called Dorothy and told her about the meeting. You did it, she said with admiration in her voice. You actually stood up to them. I don't feel victorious, I admitted. I feel heartbroken. Heartbreaking, Dorothy said gently, is often the first step toward healing. You can't fix a problem you won't acknowledge, and you can't heal from wounds you won't admit exist. She was right. For years, I had been pretending that my children's treatment of me was acceptable, that their conditional love was still love, that their manipulation was really concern. Admitting the truth hurt, but it also freed me to begin building a life based on reality instead of wishful thinking. Christmas was 10 days away. For the first time in decades, I would be spending it alone. The thought should have terrified me, but instead, I found myself looking forward to a holiday without obligations, without performance, without the exhausting effort of trying to buy love with perfect meals and expensive gifts. But before I could embrace my new freedom completely, my children had one more devastating surprise in store for me. One final test of my resolve that would either break me or complete my transformation from victim to survivor. The surprise came on Christmas Eve, delivered not by my children directly, but by the Chicago police. I was sitting in my apartment, reading by the Christmas tree I had bought for myself, a small, perfect pine decorated with ornaments that held no painful memories, when the knock came at my door. Mrs. Thompson? I'm Officer Rodriguez with the Chicago Police Department. We've received a wellness check request regarding your safety and mental state. My heart stopped. A wellness check. The nuclear option for adult children who want to override their elderly parents' autonomy. Who requested the check? I asked, though I already knew. Your daughter Patricia contacted us. She expressed concerns that you might be experiencing depression or cognitive decline that could put you at risk of self-harm or neglect. Self-harm. They had told the police I might be suicidal. Officer Rodriguez was professional but thorough. He walked through my apartment, noting the cleanliness and organization, my well-stocked refrigerator, my paid bills neatly filed, my prescription medications properly managed. He asked detailed questions about my daily routine, my social contacts, my mental state. Mrs. Thompson, I have to ask, have you had thoughts of hurting yourself or others? No, officer. I'm in the best mental health I've experienced in years. Your daughter mentioned that you've become isolated from family, that you've been making unusual financial decisions, and that you've expressed hostility toward people trying to help you. There it was. The same manipulation they had tried in our family meeting, now filtered through law enforcement. Officer Rodriguez, my daughter and I have different perspectives on what constitutes healthy boundaries. I've taken control of my own finances and refused to continue lending money to adult children. She sees this as evidence of decline. I see it as evidence of growth. The officer spent another 30 minutes with me, and it became clear that he could see no evidence of the concerning behaviors Patricia had described. I was lucid, organized, well cared for, and obviously capable of independent living. Mrs. Thompson, I'm going to document that this wellness check found no evidence of safety concerns or self-neglect. However, I should tell you that this kind of family dispute often escalates. You might want to consider family counseling or mediation. After he left, I sat in my quiet apartment and confronted the full extent of my children's willingness to destroy me to get what they wanted. Calling the police to report me as mentally unstable wasn't just manipulation, it was a direct attack on my reputation and my freedom. Patricia had used her medical background to add credibility to false claims about my mental state. She had involved law enforcement in what was essentially a family financial dispute. She had tried to create an official record of my supposed incompetence. If Officer Rodriguez had been less perceptive, if I had been having a bad day, if any number of small factors had aligned differently, I could have been involuntarily hospitalized for psychological evaluation. I could have been placed under temporary guardianship pending a competency hearing. My own daughter had been willing to risk my freedom, my dignity, and my reputation to maintain her control over my life and her access to my money. That night was the longest of my life. Not because I was afraid or lonely, but because I was finally forced to acknowledge a truth I had been avoiding. My children didn't just dislike me or take me for granted. They actively viewed me as an obstacle to their financial security, an enemy to be defeated rather than a mother to be loved. The grief of that realization was so profound it was almost physical. I mourned not just the relationship I thought I had with them, but the people I thought they were. I grieved the mother I had been, devoted, sacrificing, endlessly forgiving, because I finally understood that all of that love had been misplaced. But in the morning, something had changed. The grief was still there, but it was accompanied by a fierce determination I had never felt before. I called Ms. Chen and told her about the wellness check. Mrs. Thompson, this is exactly what we prepared for. Filing false reports about elderly relatives is a form of abuse, and it's often a precursor to more aggressive legal action. We need to document this incident carefully and prepare for whatever comes next. What came next was Christmas Day itself, a day that would test every boundary I had set and every lesson I had learned about my own worth. I woke Christmas morning to silence. No phone calls, no texts, no visits. For the first time in over 50 years, I had no one to cook for, no schedule to maintain, no family drama to manage. The initial feeling was disorienting, like waking up in a foreign country where the customs are unfamiliar. But as the morning progressed, something wonderful happened. I began to enjoy myself. I made myself a leisurely breakfast: real eggs Benedict, fresh fruit, good coffee. I ate it while watching the snow fall outside my window, feeling peaceful in a way I hadn't experienced since childhood. At noon, there was a knock at my door. I opened it to find Mr. Rivera, my neighbor, holding a plate of homemade tamales. "Merry Christmas, Mrs. Thompson," he said with his warm smile. "I made too many for just me, and I thought you might enjoy some authentic Mexican Christmas food." This man, who owed me nothing, had thought of me on Christmas Day. This virtual stranger had shown me more genuine kindness than my own children. "Mr. Rivera, would you like to come in for coffee? I have some Christmas cookies I made yesterday." We spent 2 hours talking, really talking, not the careful conversations I had grown accustomed to with my family. Mr. Rivera told me about his grandchildren in Mexico, his work as a retired mechanic, his late wife's famous tamale recipe. I told him about Harold, about my volunteer work at the library, about my newfound interest in learning to paint. "You seem different lately, Mrs. Thompson," he said as he prepared to leave. "Lighter, like some burden has been lifted." "I think it has been," I said. "I've stopped trying to carry weight that was never mine to carry." That afternoon, Dorothy called to check on me. "How are you holding up, honey? I know holidays can be hard when family relationships are complicated." "Dorothy, I'm having the most peaceful Christmas I've had in years. No stress, no performance anxiety, no walking on eggshells. Just quiet and contentment." "Good for you. You deserve peace." That evening, I did something I hadn't done in decades. I took a bubble bath and read a novel for pure pleasure. No guilt about time wasting, no anxiety about what I should be doing instead, no thoughts about anyone else's needs or expectations. As I sat in that warm bath, reading a romance novel and drinking wine, I realized this was what Harold had wanted for me. This freedom, this self-care, this permission to exist for my own pleasure instead of everyone else's convenience. But my peace was interrupted by my phone ringing at 9 p.m. Patricia's name appeared on the screen. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Mom, I hope you're satisfied." Patricia's voice was cold and accusing. "Emma's been crying all day because Grandma didn't call her on Christmas. Jake asked me why you hate us now. You've ruined Christmas for your own grandchildren." The emotional manipulation was so blatant it was almost funny. Patricia, who had called the police to report me as mentally unstable, was now claiming I had ruined Christmas by not reaching out to family members who had spent months documenting my supposed incompetence. "Patricia, you called the police and told them I was mentally unstable and possibly suicidal. That was 2 days ago. Did you really expect Christmas calls after that? That was out of concern for your safety. It has nothing to do with the children's relationship with their grandmother. It has everything to do with it. You tried to have me declared incompetent, and when that failed, you tried to create a paper trail of mental health issues by involving law enforcement. Now you're upset that I'm not pretending everything is normal? Mom, we're your family. We love you. Can't we move past this and just have a normal Christmas?" Normal? As if there were a way to return to normal after discovering that your children view you as an obstacle to their inheritance, as a problem to be managed, rather than a person to be loved. Patricia, there is no normal anymore. There's only moving forward with honesty about who we all are and what we all want. What does that mean? I took a deep breath and said something I never thought I would say to one of my children. "It means I'm done pretending that your love is unconditional when it's clearly dependent on my financial availability. I'm done accepting disrespect, because I'm afraid of being alone. I'm done being a victim of my own generosity." Mom, you're talking crazy again. This is exactly what we're worried about. Patricia, I'm talking clearly for the first time in years. If that sounds crazy to you, it's because you're used to me being confused and manipulatable. The call ended with Patricia hanging up on me. 30 minutes later, Susan called with a similar script. Accusations of ruining Christmas, guilt about the grandchildren, pleas to just be normal again. I didn't answer when Michael called an hour later. Instead, I turned off my phone and returned to my bath, my book, and my wine. I had chosen peace over performance, self-respect over family drama, honesty over enabling. For the first time in my adult life, Christmas night found me completely alone and completely content. I wasn't lonely because I finally understood the difference between solitude and loneliness. Solitude is chosen. Loneliness is imposed. Solitude is peaceful. Loneliness is painful. I had chosen solitude over the loneliness of being surrounded by people who saw me as a burden. I had chosen self-respect over the hollow victory of being needed by people who didn't actually want me. That night, as I prepared for bed in my quiet apartment, I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror and said something I had never said before. "I'm proud of you, Evelyn. You did the right thing, and you did it with dignity." The woman looking back at me was different from the one who had hosted that awful Thanksgiving dinner. She stood straighter, looked more alert, seemed more present in her own life. The next few months would bring more challenges, more tests of my resolve, more attempts by my children to regain control over my life and my finances. But Christmas Day had marked a turning point. I had proven to myself that I could be alone without being miserable, that I could choose self-preservation without feeling guilty, that I could value myself even when the people I loved most didn't. The worst was behind me. The best, my rebirth as a woman who knew her own worth, was just beginning. The week between Christmas and New Year's brought a final, shocking revelation that completed my understanding of my children's true motivations and marked the end of any possibility of reconciliation. I was sorting through old mail when I found an envelope that had been mistakenly delivered to my neighbor and only recently returned to me. It was addressed to Michael, but sent to my address. Apparently, he had given my apartment as his mailing address for some purpose. Inside was a letter from an investment firm in downtown Chicago, confirming his enrollment in their inheritance planning services and discussing strategies for maximizing estate value while minimizing tax implications for beneficiaries. The letter was dated 6 months before Harold's death. 6 months before Harold died, Michael had been planning for his inheritance. While I was caring for my terminally ill husband, Michael was calculating his financial benefit from Harold's eventual death. But that wasn't the worst discovery in that envelope. Clipped to the investment firm letter was a handwritten note from Michael to the financial advisor. "My mother has always been financially naive, so I expect to handle most of the estate management after my father passes. She'll probably need guidance on every major decision, which should make the transition smooth." Financially naive. He had been planning to manipulate me based on assumptions about my incompetence before Harold had even died. Everything that had followed. His expectation of controlling his inheritance. His frustration when I started making independent financial decisions. His attempts to have me declared incompetent. Had been planned from the beginning. I sat in my kitchen holding that letter and felt the final piece of my heart break. Not the dramatic shattering I had experienced during previous revelations, but the quiet dissolution of the last illusions I had maintained about my relationship with my eldest child. Michael hadn't been corrupted by grief or financial pressure. He had been calculating and manipulative from the moment Harold became seriously ill. He had seen his father's approaching death not as a tragedy to be mourned, but as an opportunity to be managed. And he had seen me not as a grieving widow who would need support and compassion, but as an obstacle who would need to be maneuvered around or controlled. That afternoon, I called Mr. Peterson and Ms. Chen for a joint conference call. "Mrs. Thompson, Miss Yar," Chen said after I read them the contents of Michael's letter. "This document establishes a pattern of predatory behavior toward you that goes back years. Combined with the other evidence we've collected, this would be compelling in any legal proceeding. But more importantly," Mr. Peterson added, "this should give you complete confidence in your decisions about your estate planning. Your son's behavior has been calculated and self-serving from the beginning. You owe him nothing." That evening, I made changes to my will that reflected my new understanding of my children's characters and my new commitment to my own values. The bulk of my estate would go to charities, organizations that helped elderly people maintain their independence, scholarships for students who couldn't afford college, medical research foundations. My children would each receive modest inheritances, enough to show that I hadn't forgotten them, but not enough to make them wealthy. The Oak Park house would go to Emma and Jake, my grandchildren, but not until they turned 30, old enough to make mature decisions about the property without parental manipulation. Most satisfying of all, I established a trust fund for elderly people experiencing financial abuse from family members. The Evelyn Thompson Foundation would provide legal assistance and financial counseling to seniors in situations similar to mine. My suffering would become other people's protection. My painful education would become resources for other vulnerable adults. As I signed the new will, I felt a sense of completion I hadn't expected. This wasn't revenge. It was justice. It wasn't punishment. It was consequences. It wasn't cruelty. It was honesty about what my children had earned through their behavior. New Year's Eve arrived with Chicago buried under 2 feet of snow. I spent it with Dorothy and Mr. Rivera and 3 other neighbors, having a quiet party in the building's common room. We played cards, shared stories, and toasted the new year with champagne that tasted like possibility. At midnight, as we raised our glasses, Dorothy made a toast. To Evelyn, who taught us all that it's never too late to claim your own life. To second chances, Mr. Rivera added, and the courage to take them. As I sipped my champagne, I thought about the woman I had been 1 year ago. Anxious, diminished, desperately trying to purchase love with money and services. That woman seemed like a stranger now. Someone I remembered fondly but could no longer become. The phone calls from my children continued sporadically through January, but they had a different quality now. Gone were the demands and manipulations. In their place were awkward attempts at reconciliation that felt more like negotiations than genuine apologies. Michael called once to ask if we could start fresh and put our misunderstanding behind us. When I asked him to acknowledge the ways he had contributed to our estrangement, he insisted that we both shared blame and should move forward without dwelling on the past. No acknowledgement of his financial manipulation, no apology for trying to have me declared incompetent, no recognition that I had legitimate grievances that deserved to be addressed. Susan's approach was to act as if nothing had happened while gradually reintroducing requests for help. She called to chat about neutral topics, but every conversation eventually included a small ask. Could I watch Emma next weekend? Did I have any thoughts about Jake's school problems? Had I reconsidered my position on helping family in emergencies? Patricia simply stopped calling altogether, as if my refusal to accept her control had meant the end of any relationship that didn't include her authority over my life. I began to understand that their vision of reconciliation looked exactly like our previous relationship. Me giving, them taking, with the addition of their increased caution about pushing me too far too fast. But I was no longer the woman who would accept scraps of conditional affection in exchange for financial services. I was no longer willing to pretend that manipulation was love, that exploitation was family values, that my boundaries were negotiable. By February, the calls stopped entirely, not because we had resolved our differences, but because they had finally accepted that I would not return to being the controllable, exploitable woman I had been before. The silence that followed wasn't the hollow, anxious silence of estrangement. It was the rich, purposeful silence of a woman who had chosen peace over performance, self-respect over family approval. Have you ever discovered that some relationships end not because of one dramatic betrayal, but because quiet honesty makes them impossible to continue? Have you ever found that the people who claim to love you most are actually the most threatened by your growth and independence? The hardest lesson I learned was that sometimes love isn't enough. Sometimes the people we love most are the ones we need to protect ourselves from, not because they're evil, but because the dynamic between us has become toxic for everyone involved. My children weren't monsters. They were adults who had been trained by my enabling to see me as a resource rather than a person, who had learned that my love was unconditional enough to survive their worst behavior. But unconditional love, I finally understood, doesn't mean accepting treatment that diminishes your dignity or compromises your well-being. It means loving people enough to stop enabling their worst impulses, even when that means accepting the loss of the relationship. As winter turned to spring, I began the most exciting chapter of my life. At 73, I was finally free to discover who I was when I wasn't trying to be everything to everyone else. I signed up for painting classes at the community center and discovered I had a natural talent for watercolors. My instructor, a woman in her 50s named Claire, became a real friend, someone who enjoyed my company for its own sake, who laughed at my jokes and shared her own struggles and victories. I joined a book club at the library and found myself in spirited debates about literature with people who valued my opinions and insights. I volunteered at a literacy program, teaching adults to read, and discovered the profound satisfaction of giving my time and skills to people who appreciated them. I even started dating, if you can call it that, at 73. Mr. Rivera and I began taking walks along Lake Michigan, sharing stories and comfortable silences. Nothing romantic, but a warm companionship that reminded me what it felt like to be valued for who I was, rather than what I could provide. Most importantly, I began traveling. The first trip was to Florida in March, a week of warm sunshine, art galleries, and the simple pleasure of making decisions based solely on my own desires. I walked on beaches, read novels by the pool, and ate in restaurants where no one knew my history or had expectations about my behavior. The second trip was to Ireland in May, a journey I had dreamed of for decades but never taken, because there had always been someone else's needs to consider first. I toured ancient castles, walked through green countryside, and spent evenings in pubs listening to traditional music and talking with strangers who became temporary friends. Each trip, each new experience, each moment of genuine pleasure was proof that my life was not ending, but beginning. I was not becoming smaller and more irrelevant with age. I was expanding into the person I had never had the freedom to be. The Oak Park house, which I had never seen until that devastating discovery day, became my weekend retreat. I furnished it with pieces I chose for my own pleasure rather than anyone else's approval. I planted a garden full of flowers I loved, regardless of whether they were practical or low maintenance. On Sunday mornings, I would sit on the back porch with my coffee and my watercolors, painting the garden as it changed through the seasons, feeling Harold's presence as a blessing rather than a burden. He had wanted me to be happy, and I was finally honoring that wish. The financial security I had discovered changed everything, but not in the way you might expect. The money itself mattered less than the knowledge that I didn't have to depend on anyone else's approval for my survival. I could make choices based on my own values, rather than other people's expectations. I could say no without fearing abandonment because I was no longer afraid of being alone. By summer, I realized that I had not just survived my family's betrayal, I had been liberated by it. Their attempts to control me had forced me to save myself. Their refusal to love me unconditionally had taught me to love myself that way. The Evelyn Thompson Foundation was officially established in July, with legal aid clinics in 3 Chicago neighborhoods and a helpline for seniors experiencing family financial abuse. The first person we helped was a 78-year-old man whose daughter had been forging his signature on checks. The second was a widow whose son had convinced her to sign over her house to avoid estate taxes, then tried to evict her. Each person we helped felt like a letter to my former self. The woman who had been so isolated in her suffering that she couldn't imagine others were experiencing similar betrayals. We weren't just providing legal services. We were creating community for people who had been taught to suffer in silence. The most surprising development was reconnecting with my grandchildren. Emma, now 13, reached out via social media in August. Her message was simple. "Grandma, I miss you. Can we talk?" Our phone conversation revealed that she had been told I was going through a difficult time and needed space to work on my problems. She hadn't been told about the financial conflicts or the attempts to have me declared incompetent. In her understanding, I had simply withdrawn from the family for mysterious reasons. "I don't understand why we can't see you anymore," she said with the heartbreaking directness of adolescence. Did we do something wrong? Through careful questioning, I learned that Emma had been shielded from most of the adult conflicts, but she had sensed the tension and drawn her own conclusions about her role in my absence. "Emma, you and Jake have never done anything wrong. The problems are between the adults in the family, and they have nothing to do with how much I love you both." We began having weekly phone calls, carefully scheduled when her parents weren't home. Emma told me about school, her friends, her art projects. I told her about my painting classes, my travels, my volunteer work. We built a relationship based on genuine interest in each other's lives rather than obligation or guilt. When she asked why I didn't come to family gatherings anymore, I gave her an age-appropriate version of the truth. Sometimes adults disagree about important things, and they need time apart to figure out how to treat each other with respect. "I love your parents, but we see some things very differently right now. Are you lonely?" she asked with the perceptive concern that runs in our family. "No, sweetheart. I'm not lonely at all. I have wonderful friends. I'm learning new things, and I'm happier than I've been in years. Loneliness comes from being around people who don't value you. I'd rather be alone than feel lonely." Those words, spoken to comfort my granddaughter, completed my understanding of my own transformation. I wasn't a victim anymore. I wasn't a woman diminished by loss and betrayal. I was someone who had chosen authenticity over approval, self-respect over false peace, truth over comfortable lies. By autumn, the 1-year anniversary of that awful Thanksgiving dinner, I had become completely comfortable with the new shape of my life. I had real friendships based on mutual respect and enjoyment. I had activities that challenged and fulfilled me. I had financial security that freed me from anxiety about the future. I had a sense of purpose through my foundation work that connected me to something larger than my own experiences. Most importantly, I had learned to distinguish between loneliness and solitude, between love and enabling, between family loyalty and self-betrayal. On Thanksgiving Day 2024, exactly 1 year after Michael's cruel laughter had shattered my illusions, I hosted a dinner party for 8 people: Dorothy and Mr. Rivera Claire from my art class, 3 other friends from various activities, and by special arrangement, Emma. Emma had asked her parents if she could spend Thanksgiving with me, claiming a school project required her to interview an older relative about family history. It wasn't entirely a lie. She was genuinely interested in learning about Harold and our early marriage, about my childhood, about the family stories that had been lost in the chaos of recent conflicts. The dinner I prepared was simple but delicious. No desperate attempts to impress, no anxiety about perfection, no performance for people who wouldn't appreciate the effort. Just good food shared with people who genuinely wanted to be there. As we sat around my table, the same table where my children had held their intervention meeting the previous Christmas, I looked at the faces around me and saw something I had never experienced with my own family dinners: pure enjoyment of each other's company. Mr. Rivera told stories about his childhood in Mexico that made everyone laugh. Claire shared her struggles with dating in her 50s that made everyone nod with recognition. Dorothy regaled us with tales from her career as a social worker that reminded us all of how much resilience people can find when they need it. Emma, the youngest person at the table by 40 years, was treated like the intelligent, interesting person she was becoming rather than a child to be managed or ignored. She told us about her school's art program, her plans to study abroad someday, her dreams of becoming a documentary filmmaker. "Grandma," she said as we were clearing the dinner plates, "this is the most interesting Thanksgiving I've ever had. Usually family dinners are kind of tense. People seem like they're performing instead of just talking. Performing." At 13, Emma had identified what I had taken 7 decades to understand. "That's because these people are here because they want to be," I explained. "When people choose to spend time with you instead of feeling obligated to, everything is different." After dinner, we played cards and shared stories about what we were grateful for. When my turn came, I said something that surprised even me. "I'm grateful for last year's Thanksgiving dinner. I'm grateful that my son was cruel enough to break through my denial about our family dynamics. I'm grateful that my children tried to control me because it forced me to learn how to protect myself. I'm grateful for every painful moment that brought me to this better life." Emma looked confused, but the adults around the table nodded with understanding. Pain that teaches you something valuable isn't wasted pain. Betrayal that frees you from unhealthy relationships is ultimately a gift, even when it doesn't feel like one at the time. As my guests prepared to leave, Dorothy pulled me aside. "You know," she said, "you're not the same person who called me crying about your children's behavior. You've become, I don't know how to describe it. More yourself, maybe? More myself." Yes, that was exactly right. I had stripped away everything I thought I was supposed to be and discovered who I actually was underneath it all. I had stopped performing the role of the self-sacrificing mother and started living as Evelyn, a woman with her own interests, opinions, boundaries, and dreams. The evening ended with hugs and plans for future gatherings. Emma, who would be returning to her parents' house that night, lingered at the door. "Grandma, I hope someday I can be as brave as you." "What do you mean, sweetheart? You chose to be happy even when it meant disappointing people you love. That's the hardest kind of brave." As I closed the door behind my guests and surveyed my quiet apartment, plates in the sink, leftover food wrapped in the refrigerator, the lingering warmth of genuine human connection, I realized that Emma was right. I had learned a kind of courage I hadn't known existed. The courage to disappoint people whose approval wasn't worth earning. The courage to value my own peace over other people's comfort. The courage to believe that I deserved better than what I had been accepting for decades. That night, I sat in my bedroom and wrote in the journal I had started keeping since my transformation began. 1 year ago, I thought my family's love was the most important thing in my life. I was wrong. The most important thing in my life is my own self-respect. Family love that requires me to be smaller, poorer, less than I can be, is not actually love at all. It's convenience disguised as affection, manipulation dressed up as concern. I spent 72 years trying to earn love by giving away pieces of myself. I have learned that real love, the kind worth having, doesn't require you to diminish yourself to receive it. Real love celebrates your growth, respects your boundaries, and values your happiness. I am not lonely. I am not bitter. I am not angry. I am free. Christmas 2024 passed peacefully, with gifts exchanged among my chosen family of friends and a quiet celebration that felt like a reward for surviving the previous year's trauma. I sent cards to my children with brief, warm messages that expressed love without invitation. I received none in return, but their silence no longer caused me pain. Emma called on Christmas morning to thank me for the art supplies I had sent, and to tell me about her own small rebellion. She had asked for books for Christmas instead of clothes, and her parents had been puzzled but supportive. "I'm becoming more like you, Grandma," she said. "More interested in what I actually want instead of what people think I should want. That's the best possible Christmas gift you could give me," I told her, and meant it completely. As 2025 began, I found myself looking forward instead of backward for the first time in years. I had travel plans for the spring. a painting retreat in Tuscany that would combine my new artistic interests with my love of learning about different cultures. I had signed up for a creative writing class, curious about whether I could turn my experiences into stories that might help other people in similar situations. The Evelyn Thompson Foundation was expanding, with plans to open a safe house for elderly people who needed temporary shelter while escaping financial abuse from family members. We were also launching an educational program to help seniors recognize the warning signs of exploitation before it became severe. My own healing had become a resource for other people's healing. My liberation had become a pathway for other people's freedom. The final piece of my transformation came in March, when I received an unexpected phone call from Susan. "Mom," she said, her voice smaller and less certain than I had heard it in years. "I've been thinking about our last conversation, and I owe you an apology." The admission surprised me, but I waited to see whether it would be followed by genuine understanding or merely another manipulation attempt. "I've been talking to a counselor," Susan continued, "about family relationships and boundaries. She helped me see that I was treating you like a resource instead of a person. I was so focused on what you could provide for us that I stopped seeing you as someone with your own needs and feelings." This was more self-awareness than any of my children had ever demonstrated. I listened carefully as Susan continued. "I realize now that when you started saying no to our requests for help, you weren't being selfish or experiencing mental decline. You were finally standing up for yourself after years of us taking advantage of your generosity." "What made you realize that?" I asked. "Honestly, Emma, she came home from Thanksgiving at your place and wouldn't stop talking about how happy you seemed, how interesting your friends were, how different you were when you weren't stressed about family dynamics. It made me realize that maybe the problem wasn't that you had changed. Maybe the problem was how we had been treating you." I felt something I hadn't expected, a flicker of hope, not for returning to our previous relationship, but for building something healthier and more honest. "I don't know if you can forgive me," Susan said, "or if you even want to try to rebuild a relationship with me, but I wanted you to know that I understand now what we did to you, and I'm ashamed of it." "Susan," I said carefully, "I appreciate your apology and I believe it's sincere, but apologies only mean something if they're followed by changed behavior. If you want to rebuild our relationship, it would have to be on entirely different terms." "What kind of terms?" "Terms where you see me as a person, not a resource. Terms where you're interested in my life, not just what I can do for yours. Terms where you respect my boundaries without arguing or trying to manipulate me into changing them." "I think I can do that," Susan said. "I want to try." We agreed to start slowly. Occasional phone calls with no agenda beyond connecting as people, perhaps eventually progressing to visits that didn't involve requests for help or criticism of my choices. The conversation with Susan didn't erase the previous year's betrayals, but it offered something I had stopped hoping for: the possibility that at least one of my children might be capable of growth and change. Michael and Patricia never called. I didn't expect them to. Some people are able to reflect on their behavior and make changes when they see the consequences. Others double down on their original position, convinced that everyone else is wrong and they are perpetual victims of other people's unreasonableness. I had learned to accept both responses without taking them personally. My worth was not determined by my children's capacity for growth or their willingness to treat me with respect. My happiness was not dependent on their approval or their presence in my life. By my 74th birthday in April, I had achieved something I had never imagined possible. I was completely comfortable with who I was and how I had chosen to live. I liked my daily routine, my friendships, my activities, my quiet apartment, and my weekend house. I liked the woman I saw in the mirror, confident, purposeful, unashamed of taking up space in the world. The birthday party my friends threw for me was small, but perfect. Good food, genuine laughter, thoughtful conversation, and the kind of deep contentment that comes from being surrounded by people who value you for exactly who you are. Emma called to sing happy birthday and tell me about her acceptance into a summer art program. Mr. Rivera brought me flowers from his own garden. Dorothy gave me a book of poetry she thought I would enjoy. Claire surprised me with a small watercolor she had painted of my Oak Park garden. Each gift, each gesture, each moment of celebration felt earned in a way that previous birthday celebrations never had. These people weren't there because they felt obligated or because they wanted something from me. They were there because they genuinely cared about my happiness. As I blew out the candles on my cake, I made a wish that would have seemed impossible 2 years earlier. I wished for more years exactly like the life I was currently living. Not years spent trying to change other people or fix broken relationships, but years of continued growth, joy, and the deep satisfaction that comes from living authentically. That night, as I prepared for bed in my peaceful apartment, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. 2 years ago, I had been a woman diminished by her own generosity, trapped by her own enabling, slowly dying from the emotional poison of relationships based on manipulation rather than love. Tonight, I was a woman who knew her own worth, who had learned to distinguish between love and exploitation, who had built a life based on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than guilt and obligation. The transformation hadn't been easy. There had been nights of grief that felt like physical illness, moments of doubt when I wondered if I was destroying something precious rather than protecting myself from something toxic. Days when the courage required to maintain my boundaries felt beyond my capabilities, but every difficult moment had been worth it for the peace I felt now. Every painful conversation had been necessary to reach this place of authentic happiness. Every relationship I had lost had made space for better relationships to develop. I had learned that it's never too late to choose yourself. It's never too late to demand respect. It's never too late to stop settling for scraps of conditional affection when you could have the feast of genuine love, starting with love for yourself. As I turned off the lights and settled into bed, I thought about the woman I had been on that awful Thanksgiving day when this journey began. I felt compassion for her desperation, admiration for her strength, and gratitude for her finally finding the courage to save herself. That woman had thought her story was ending in failure and loneliness. Instead, it had been the prologue to the most authentic, joyful chapter of her entire life. Tomorrow would bring new adventures, new discoveries, new opportunities to continue becoming the woman I was meant to be. At 74, I was just getting started. My story isn't unique, unfortunately. Across the country, thousands of elderly people are experiencing financial and emotional abuse from family members who see them as obstacles to inheritance rather than people worthy of respect. Many of them are suffering in silence, believing that family loyalty requires accepting treatment that diminishes their dignity and compromises their well-being. But my story is also a testament to the possibility of transformation at any age. It's proof that it's never too late to choose authenticity over approval, self-respect over false peace, truth over comfortable lies. If you're listening to this and recognizing pieces of your own experience, please know that you're not alone. Please know that you deserve better than what you're accepting. Please know that it's possible to build a life based on your own values rather than other people's expectations, even if it means disappointing people you love. The hardest question I had to answer was this: what's more important, being loved by people who don't respect you, or being respected by people who genuinely care about your well-being? For 72 years, I chose to be loved without being respected. For the past 2 years, I've chosen to be respected, and I've discovered that real love always includes respect. The people who love me now value my boundaries, celebrate my growth, and support my happiness without expecting anything in return except the pleasure of my company. That's the kind of love that's worth having. That's the kind of love that's worth waiting for, even if it means letting go of relationships that were never as loving as they appeared to be. Have you ever found yourself giving away pieces of your soul to purchase other people's affection? Have you ever realized that the people you've sacrificed the most for are the ones who appreciate you the least? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear to find the courage to choose themselves. And if this story touched you, if it felt familiar, if it gave you hope or courage or simply the comfort of knowing you're not alone, please like this video and subscribe. When we share our stories of transformation, we create pathways for other people's healing. When we speak honestly about the cost of enabling and the value of boundaries, we give others permission to save themselves. The most radical thing an elderly person can do in a youth-obsessed, family loyalty-demanding culture is to insist on their own worth, to refuse to be diminished, to choose growth over comfort, healing over harmony, authentic happiness over the performance of contentment. I spent 72 years trying to be the perfect mother, the perfect widow, the perfect grandmother. I have spent 2 years learning to be perfectly myself. I recommend the second approach without reservation. Your life is not over when your children become adults. Your worth is not determined by your willingness to subsidize other people's choices. Your happiness matters as much as anyone else's, including the people you raised, the people you love, the people who share your blood. You are not required to set yourself on fire to keep other people warm. You are not obligated to remain small so that others can feel large. You are not meant to disappear into other people's needs and dreams and ambitions. You are meant to live fully, love wisely, and give generously, but only to people who value what you're offering and treat you with the respect you deserve. At 74, I am living the best years of my life, not because my circumstances are perfect, but because my choices are finally aligned with my values. Not because I have everything I want, but because I no longer want anything that requires me to betray myself to obtain it. This is my gift to you. The knowledge that transformation is possible, that courage can be cultivated, that it's never too late to choose the beautiful difficulty of living authentically over the familiar misery of living for other people's approval. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for witnessing my transformation. Thank you for considering the possibility of your own. Now go live the life you were meant to live. Go claim the respect you were meant to receive. Go become the person you were meant to be before the world convinced you to be smaller, quieter, more convenient for everyone else. Your authentic life is waiting, and unlike the people who have been taking you for granted, it will never disappoint you.